There we go. Okay. So you can find it on Packagist or in the TER. Basically, this is the totally opposite of what the others have been talking about. This is not about outputting to the front end. This is about inputting to the back end. Before I go into exactly what this is all about and how it works, very briefly about myself. I am Mathias Lesniak. I work for Pixelant in Norway. I also live outside of Oslo in Norway. I have a wife and 2 kids. I have been using TYPO3 since 2003, and I usually say that I crashed my first TYPO3 installation, and I did. I'm a member of the TYPO3 Association board, and there's a lot of Mathiases in the TYPO3 world, so I'm not the other Mathias. I am me. So, very good. Okay, back to this extension. We created this extension based on an old idea that I have been working with for at least 10 years, I think. But we have a lot of customers that have products and other data that they want to import into TYPO3. That data often comes from stuff like PIM systems, so product databases, or other systems that are very large and very complex, and the way to get the data out of them is not always very easy. So one thing, for example, is that we worked with a particular PIM system that very much liked to tell us that, well, I've changed an image. Well, where does that image belong? Well, the data basically comes very non-linear, which meant that with the previous version of our importer, which was built with EXT, you basically had to read in this image, and then you had to iterate through hundreds and thousands and millions of EXT objects that all had to be created with all of their relations. And one of the issues we had was that that process used a lot of memory, and we had an import process that took more than 2 gigabytes of memory, and even more when we started trying to fix it. So it ended up being unfixable, I think. So then what we did was that we looked around, and we found an extension called REST, but it's also using EXT, but we got some inspiration from that, and we started building our own REST-based TYPO3 extension for only doing creation and updating and deletion. That's what I'm going to present to you today. So first, of course, the question everybody is asking, why the heck is it called that? Well, it's short for Integration REST API because we use it for integrations into TYPO3. So we call it interest. And what does it do? So basically, it creates a command line interface and a REST front end to TYPO3's data handler. If you're not very deeply into TYPO3, well, the data handler is what handles the data when you save a form in the TYPO3 backend. So it does some processing, and it handles some relations, and it does a lot of really helpful stuff. In itself, the data handler has been around for a very long time, but it does its work, and we've tried to implement this extension in a way that can both support this data handler and whatever future version might come. The interest extension has something really fancy that's called remote ID mapping, which I'll go into in a moment. But it allows you to send data to it in any order. So you can say that, well, I have an image, and then you can send a lot of other data, and then you can send whatever content element that image belongs to, and it will handle that without complaining, which is one of the things that has been really important for us in reducing memory footprint and trying to create a better way to import large amounts of data. It also has flexible file uploading, which I'll also show to you. It has data transformations, which means that if you get data in that is always wrong, you can reformat it and correct it. It has a number of optimizations. And as I said, it's very close to the TYPO3 data handler. So it's close to TYPO3's core, which is also one of the main goals we had. So the idea is that it should be easy to upgrade going forward. We're just adding another layer on top of what's already there in TYPO3 without using XBase. So this thing about remote ID. It's basically a way to refer to a record in TYPO3 using an external identifier. So what happens very often is that you have the cloud and you have TYPO3 and you want to push something into TYPO3. So you push some data there, but in order to be able to reference that data later on, you usually have to read some kind of data going backwards. And data going backwards is hard to read, just like in the example here. It's all mirrored and weird, and you have to have somewhere to store it, and you have to have a way to deal with it. And what we wanted to do was basically just push data to TYPO3. And of course, we can handle errors, but we don't really want to do a lot more than push correct data to TYPO3. So what we're doing is basically removing the need for a return or handling a return and just pushing data to TYPO3. That's of course a simplification, but really that is what it does. And remote IDs can look like anything. It could be anything that you understand on the remote side. So in the cloud, it could be anything. The only requirement that we have for the remote ID is that the remote ID has to be unique on your end, because then it's also unique on our end. And it's mapped then directly both to a UID in TYPO3 and a table. So it handles both of those data points. Now here's an example. It's just a one-way communication, and if I send the remote ID news-123 to the interest extension, it will know that this is about the news table and what ID to connect it to. And I can reuse that forever. Another really nice thing about the interest extension is this thing about that you can insert data in any order. So this thing I talked about, the image coming before the article or the article coming before the image, that is handled within the extension. So one really common example is that you want to insert a sys file reference record into the database. So this is the connection point between any content element, for example, and a file. And the problem when you do that as the first step is that TYPO3 is going to say that won't work. It requires a reference to a file. You can't create a sys file reference without having an actual file there. If you try, it's going to cause you lots of headaches and troubles. And what the interest extension does is that it just takes your data and says, thank you very much. I love your data. I don't understand what I'm going to do with it yet, but it saves it somewhere and it waits for this sys file to be created. It knows that the sys file is there because it's referenced in the data that you're sending, but it doesn't know anything about it. So then you go and you insert this sys file record. And at that point, the interest extension will create the sys file reference record, basically by replaying the request that you did at the beginning. Another nice thing about this extension, and it helps us quite a lot with this non-linear data, is that it also remembers sorting. So for example, let's say that you create a news article, and at the moment when you create it, you have three images, image A, B, and C, that you want to have related to that news article. Well, right there and then you only have image C. The interest extension knows that, so it's going to create the news article but only put in image C. Then later on, if we didn't have any knowledge of sorting, TYPO3 would normally insert the next record for the image. When it's created, it would insert it as the last item in the list. But as you see, we actually had the order here where it was supposed to be A number 1, B number 2, and C number 3. So it doesn't actually do this. It doesn't place A after C. What it does is that it places A before C, and it knows that there is supposed to be a B there as well, coming in maybe at a later point. So if and when the image B comes along, it will be inserted in the right place. So this means that you can also work with incomplete data, which is also very handy when you work with large imports where maybe a product database might refer to type of data that you don't have or that you don't have access to yet, maybe because of a user error or simply because it's not supposed to go on the web. So that means the product or the news article or whatever record you're working with will be published even though it is based on incomplete data. Then it also has flexible file upload. And well, at the moment, it doesn't actually have file upload implemented, but it does work with files that are already uploaded and that is sent to you. So you can send information about a file to the interest extension, either as a URL to a file or as base64 data. If that URL is a link to YouTube or Vimeo, it will convert it to the normal .youtube or .vimeo, or you can also have other handlers there that handle different URLs in TYPO3. So it will appear as it would if you uploaded it through the TYPO3 backend. It also listens to headers from the server. So it checks the modification date of the file and e-tags. So it checks if a hash from the server matches the file that you have already, and it won't download the file multiple times. It can also save files into subfolders so that you don't get one folder with 100,000 files. You can split it into different folders. Very handy if you have very many files. And it handles duplicate handling just like in the backend. So you can ask it to use an existing file, or you can tell it to rename the file that you're putting there. So there's lots of different options, just like you have in the backend when you work with files. And it supports file renaming, which is really handy if you get files that have really cryptic names and you would like to give them the name of something specific that you're picking from somewhere else. Well, it has data transformations, so you can do anything standard wrap can do to the data that comes in. Or you can also write PSR14 events to transform the data or do other things related to the data that's coming in. It is also optimized, so it won't repeat the same operation twice in a row. That can happen if you're sending a lot of unstructured or relatively unstructured data to the server. It can send the same request multiple times, and that can take a lot of time to handle, so it will automatically recognize a request that has already gotten before and stop it. It won't download the same file twice, and you are able to disable reference indexing, which is handy. It takes a bit of time for TYPO3 to update its reference index. And if you have, like we had in one case, 1 or 2 million records that you just want to insert quickly into TYPO3 through this API, you can simply disable reference indexing and run that later. Also, when you're using TYPO3 version 9, the interest extension today supports both TYPO3 version 9, 10, and 11. But if you're using the oldest version, you might have experienced on your own that command line is really slow. It takes about a second in order to get a command to start up. And that's because it's warming up a lot of EXT-based configurations. And it skips that. It's overriding a little class inside of TYPO3, and basically you can still run EXT-based commands, but if you're not running an EXT-based command, it won't warm up all of the EXT-based stuff. So that saves a second per request, which is quite a lot if you have 1 million of them. The interest extension then works with, just like the other extensions we've heard about, it works with JSON data. And the format is close to that of the data handler. If you know it, well, basically it's just a list of fields and the value of the field. But as you can see here, the PID here, for example, is a text string and not an actual UID or an integer. And that is because the interest extension will automatically know what fields are references. And if they are a reference, it will treat them as remote IDs. So in this case, site root page might actually, or is in this case, a remote ID that I'm referring to, and that's going to be the PID of the potential. I think it's a page I'm inserting here. So it will save you a lot of work because you can always refer to something by its remote ID. That is also excellent if you're working with deployment and want to have a staging environment that might not be exactly the same as the live environment, and you just want to know that, well, this remote ID will always refer to that specific page, whatever UID it has in the environment that you're in. So here's a news record, for example. It will just insert and process the data in the normal way here. And this is now how a normal REST call is normally done. Here's a URL that you can send the REST call to. And as you might see, it has an endpoint, which is if you can choose whatever string you want, for example, REST or API, or, well, the default is REST here. Then you can supply the table, you can supply a remote ID, and you can supply a language. And we haven't implemented support for it yet, but, well, it's in the schema anyway. You can supply a workspace ID so that you can also work with workspaces in the future. If we put this into legible normal text, you can see that we have an endpoint that is called REST. And then comes the slash and the table name. It's always a table name when you create or insert a record into TYPO3. And then comes the remote ID, for example, a content element with some number. You can put in a language ID that could either be 2 characters or in this case 5. And then, well, since we haven't implemented workspaces yet, I'm just setting it to 0. But you can skip the 2 last ones and you can just insert using the table name or the remote ID. So if you send this to the server, a curl request will look something like this, where you have an authorization. You can read more about that in the manual. And then the URL and the data that you want to send. This is basically the simplest request that you can send to the REST API. Now, one thing that is interesting here about the authentication is that it's actually based on the real backend. So you authenticate a backend user. That means that you can also specify the read and write rights for that user exactly to the needs that you have for the data you want to create. And the data that you're inserting in the database will then also be logged, and you'll see it in the history, and you'll see that, well, it was my REST API user that created this record. You can also undo that if you would like, because you have the whole history in TYPO3, and that we did to really help our support staff who had a hard time with other importers actually seeing why is this record here, what happened to it, why is it so strange? Well, it happened with the importer, and then you can backtrack and see what actually happened. You can also do batch requests with REST, which is really handy. So for example, you can say that you only supply the table name, and then it will automatically know that in the data you're sending, you're also supplying remote IDs. You can actually even remove the table name, and then you just add another dimension to the array that you're sending to TYPO3, and it will know that you want to insert tables, and then you have the remote IDs within there. The command line interface is very similar to the REST API. It's a little bit different because command line is not the same as normal REST, but it works in the same way. Basically, if you want to create a page with the remote ID, my new page, you enter that in and you send over data to the extension, and it will create the page for you. Now the extension also supports metadata, which has shown to be extremely useful because you can submit extra information alongside the data that you want to persist. And that makes it possible for you to build in conditions or transformations depending on the metadata related to the record. And in this case, you can see here that we have, we've written some TypoScript with standard wrap, and we have a condition here that the storage PID for the data that we're writing is going to change depending on the market that's applied in the metadata. We never write the market to the database, but we use it here in a condition. So this is one example. Now, the interest extension as well has a few things that it doesn't do. It is not an extremely fast way of importing data into TYPO3. If you want to import data extremely fast, then you should do plain SQL and just dump it into the database. Because it's using the TYPO3 backend, you get a lot of good things from that, but it's definitely not going to be a lot faster than just clicking save in a form in TYPO3. So it takes a little bit of time, but it actually works quite a lot better than I at least had thought in the beginning. It does not support read operations. You have heard about two other extensions that can fine handle data that is outbound. If you want to output data, well, don't use this extension. This is only for importing. And as I said, it's really thinking about how to optimize the pushing of data to TYPO3. And it doesn't support any front-end operations. So you can't run a website off this extension at all. You need something more, and you've got some options today as well. So that's basically a quick run through of how this interest extension works. And I wonder if there is any questions. I have a few things more that I can talk about, but I'm sure that you're also probably a bit tired of sitting around. So I think your questions will probably show me what's the most important.